Alright, today we're going to talk a little bit about the miter saw. We're going to talk a little bit about what it can be used for. We'll talk about a few of the parts that you'll need to know on it, and we'll talk about how to safely use the machine. First off, what it can be used for. The best use of the miter saw is to make cross cuts and mitered cuts. So a cross cut would be going across the board like this, and a mitered cut would be going across the board at an angle like this. Those are the best uses for this. It is probably the best machine in the entire shop for doing those types of cuts. A few parts that you're going to need to know on the machine are this right here, this big flat piece, that's called the table. This vertical piece going up is called the fence. This piece right here that retracts is called the blade guard. The blade is underneath that, or behind that, of course, so this is a blade. The on-off trigger is right back here in the handle, and then there is a switch to turn a laser on and off right behind the handle as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. A lot of people do find the miter saw to be fairly intimidating. It is a pretty loud machine. It's the loudest in our shop, and it does have a pretty big blade on it, and your fingers are somewhat close to the blade, which can be kind of intimidating. But if you follow the three main rules that I have to use a miter saw and understand the other information that I'm going to talk about today, you'll be perfectly safe when using the miter saw. So, there are the three main rules that I talked about. There are three main rules that I want you to follow when you are using the miter saw. The first one might seem kind of like common sense, but it's still good to talk about. The first one is, don't put your hands in the cutting zone. You can see this blue area right here. That's the cutting zone. You never want to put your fingers there or your hands there for any reason. Even if the machine is off, even if it's unplugged, it's still not a good idea to put your hands in the cutting zone. This whole piece on the saw is held up with a spring. If that spring were to break and your hand was in the cutting zone, the entire weight of that, which is pretty heavy, could fall and land on your hand, and that could cause an injury. So you never want to put your hand in the cutting zone for any reason. Another rule that I have about that is you always want to make sure you're hanging onto your board. You don't want to just set the board on the table and then try to cut it without hanging onto the board kind of like this. You always want to make sure you have a hand on your board. And lastly, you always want to make sure the board is up against the fence. Again, the fence is this vertical piece. If you keep your board up against the fence, you hang on to it, and you don't put your hand in the cutting zone, you will be very safe when using this machine. First, moving into how to use the machine, we're going to talk a little bit about what you're going to want to think about before you start using the machine, and then we'll talk about what you'll want to think about when you are cutting with the machine. So before you even start cutting, you're going to want to think about how you're going to be cutting and what you're going to be cutting with the machine. So I have a board here set up that you can see, and I want to keep this piece and I want to get rid of the piece with the X. So I got to decide where or what side of the line I want to cut on. So you can see the line that I want to have cut, you see the piece that I want to keep and the piece I want to get rid of. I got to decide which side of that line I want to cut on. Do I want to cut on the side that I want to get rid of, or do I want to cut on the side that I'm going to keep, or maybe do I want to cut just directly on the line? The best answer for this is always cut on the waste side of the board. So this is what I call the waste side of the board. Right now, the way I'm holding the board, you'd want the blade on the left side of the board. But it depends on how you're hanging onto the board. If I'm hanging onto it like this, now I might want the blade on the right side of the board instead of the left side. Like this, left side. Like this, right side. It just kind of depends on how you're hanging onto it. And I don't want to confuse anybody by making people think it has to be the right or it has to be the left. So I like to say waste side. So you always want to make sure you're cutting on the waste side of the board. As you can see by this little cut I made right here, I didn't cut quite all the way through, but you can see how thick the blade is. They usually are about 1/8 of an inch thick. So if you put the blade on the wrong side of the line, it's going to cut that much more off your board that you might not want to cut. So for example, if I wanted this board to be exactly 18 inches long, if I have this much taken out of my board because I put the blade on the wrong side of the line, my board is now going to be maybe closer to 17 7/8 long instead of that exact 18 inches that I want. This can be a big problem, and you will get graded on how well you can make your cuts and how accurate they are. So you want to make sure you put the blade on the correct side of the line. Again, always put it on the waist side of the line. When you are doing this, you also want to make sure you are always hanging onto your board with your hand. You don't want to just let it sit there and try to cut it without it. That's not safe. That would allow the board to move back and forth as you are cutting, which could create some issues. So you always want to make sure you are hanging onto your board when you are cutting. When you are looking at your board and when you are thinking about how you're going to hang onto your board, you also want to make sure you are hanging onto the bigger piece of the board. So this one, you can see this piece that I'm getting rid of is a lot smaller. This piece is a lot bigger. I always want to make sure I'm hanging onto the bigger piece of the board for a few reasons. First off, I'm going to have a lot better control over it when I'm hanging onto the bigger piece as opposed to the smaller piece. Secondly, it gives me a little better area to hang onto the board when it's up here, and I don't have to necessarily put my fingers quite as close to the blade. Sometimes you might be cutting a bigger board like this, and this is even more true and even more important. Like right now, if I were to cut just a little bit of this board off, and if I were to hang on to the small piece, I don't have very good control over it. But if I hang on to the bigger piece, I have much, much better control over it. Another issue you might run into is if you are cutting a longer board like this, and you're hanging on to a smaller piece like this, what do you think is going to happen to that end of the board after you get done making a cut? So I just got done making a cut. Let's just pretend I did that. That end falls, this end comes up. If this end comes up when that end falls, it could jam itself into the blade, which could cause some issues to the machine or some injuries to you, and we obviously want to avoid that. So always make sure you're hanging onto the bigger part of the board. That way, if I was cutting it like this, that piece would stay supported, and this piece would stay supported also, since I am hanging onto it. So you always want to make sure you're hanging onto the bigger piece of the board when you are cutting. The types of cuts you will be allowed to make are miter and cross cuts, as I already said. There is one more type of cut that sometimes students try to make on the miter saw, and it is a very, very bad idea to try to make this cut. The type of cut I'm referring to is called a rip cut. So a rip cut would be like this black line. It'd be like cutting along the length of the board. Again, this is a cross cut, this is a miter cut, this would be a rip cut. So that'd be, if I had to do that type of cut, I'd hold it up against the saw like this, and I do not have a lot of good options here. I can't keep my fingers further than 5 inches away from the blade, which is pretty important, and I wouldn't even be able to cut through the entire board. You never want to do a rip cut. You only want to do a cross cut or a miter cut. In your case, you only have to do cross cuts in this class, so you're only going to want to do a cross cut using the miter saw. Some students think that if they have a really long board, it's better to keep their hands further away from the cutting zone. This actually isn't true, because like what we talked about with supporting the board, it's harder to support the board when your hands are a lot farther away from the cutting zone. So you want to make sure your hands are about 5 inches away. If your hands are a lot further away on a longer board like this, it might be hard and uncomfortable to stretch and try to reach that on-off switch, and you won't have as good control over it either. So you always want to make sure your hands are about 5 inches away from the machine, even if the board is really long. Some students might question, what if I have a really small board like this and I set it down and the board isn't even 5 inches wide? If you have a board that's that small and you can't keep your fingers 5 inches away, you shouldn't be cutting that board on the miter saw. This is not in the machine to make that cut. It's not going to be safe. You need to make sure the board is long enough so that way you have enough room to hang onto the board and to keep your fingers 5 inches away from the cutting zone. So like I said already, one of the rules that I already talked about, but I'm going to review it again, always keep your hands away from that cutting zone. Do not put your fingers in that cutting zone. Some students might be asking, how do I get a little piece of scrap like that away from the cutting zone if I'm not allowed to put my hands in the cutting zone? Best way to do that is grab another piece of wood that you might have laying around, that someone has laying around. There's always a few pieces of extra wood laying around here. Grab another piece and you can push it away from the cutting zone with that piece, and then you can come over and safely remove that piece without ever having to put your hands in the cutting zone. After after you have it figured out of how you're gonna make your cut and which side of the line you're gonna put the blade on, you need to think about where you're gonna put your board. Like I said earlier, it's very, very important that you put your board up against the fence. So always make sure you put your board up against the fence. If you don't put the board up against the fence, some bad things can happen. So for example, if I'm trying to make a cut and the board is away from the fence a little bit like this, I have two options. I can either hold on to that board to where it doesn't move at all, and I don't think I'm gonna be strong enough to do that, especially when this whole machine starts to vibrate, or you can probably get a kickback, and that's not very fun. What's gonna happen, what's very likely to happen is if you're making this cut and you can't hang on to it perfectly still, the board might wiggle a little bit, which then if that occurs, the blade might actually grab onto the board, taking it, ripping it away from your hands and slamming it back into that fence. And if your fingers are in between there, it might pinch your fingers in between that board and the fence, and that's not gonna feel too good either. So always make sure the board is flat up against the fence. It's a really easy way to avoid any of that issue I just talked about. Just make sure it's flat up against the fence at all times. When you have all of that figured out, you know where to put your board, you know where to put the blade. Next thing we need to talk about is how to make your cut. So when you are doing this, you will be standing directly in front of the machine, not quite where I am right now because I'm trying to show you guys the machine so you can see it a little bit better. When you are, you're going to want to think about where you're going to stand and how you're going to move the blade into the board. The best way to move the blade into the board is nice and slow. You don't want to go too fast. Some students get a little nervous and they want to go really fast to get it over as fast as possible. This almost always causes more problems than it helps. You always want to make sure you move this nice and slow. If you go too fast, what can happen is the blade can actually grab onto the board instead of cut through it because it doesn't have enough speed to cut through it, and then it can jam up the machine and kick back at you, and it can cause some injuries. So you always want to make sure you go nice and slow so that way the blade has enough time to cut through the board cleanly. You will also have a lot smoother cut if you go nice and slow. If you go really fast, the cut you're going to make is going to be a lot rougher, which means you're going to have to do more sanding, which isn't very fun either. So always make sure you go nice and slow. When you are ready to cut, another thing to think about is where do you start with this whole assembly? Do you start it in the up position, or do you want to start it in the down position, or do you want to start it maybe someplace in between? The best place to start is always the up position. Always make sure you start the machine in the up position for a couple reasons. First off, if you start in the up position, there's a better chance that the machine will be at full speed before you reach your wood, and you always want to make sure the machine is at full speed before you actually reach your material and start cutting it. Another reason why you want to start in the up position is the motor is very, very powerful. If you start it somewhat down, the motor will actually try to jerk the machine away from you just a little bit, and that can be very intimidating as well. The motor can actually, if you start the machine in a somewhat down position, the motor can actually jerk the machine away from you a little bit, which can be very intimidating. I'll demonstrate that right now. So I'm just going to squeeze the trigger very quickly, just a little bit. Observe how this whole piece lifts up really quickly. So it didn't do it a lot, but if you're already nervous to use the machine and you see this, that might intimidate you even a little bit more, which might make you a little more uncomfortable, which might not help things. So always make sure you start it in the up position so that doesn't happen. When you get done making a cut, always make sure you hold the blade down until the blade stops spinning. You don't want to start lifting the machine up until the blade is completely stopped. The blade is really, really big, as you can see and as we talked about before. It can also act like a fan. If you've ever been around fans before, you know they generally blow air out, but on the back side of the fans, they actually suck air in. And this usually acts like a fan that is sucking things in. So let's just say you just got done cutting a little piece of wood just like this, and it's sitting right next to the cutting zone. If the blade is down all the way, that little piece is going to bounce off the blade and it's not really going to cause any problems. But if you start lifting this blade back up again, the teeth and the blade start to become exposed, and that little piece could get sucked into the teeth, where the teeth could grab onto it and then it could throw it around the room. I have seen little pieces like that get thrown all the way across the room, and we obviously don't want that. So always make sure you leave it in the down position until it is completely stopped. When you are using the machine, if you're not comfortable with the sound, you are more than welcome to grab some hearing protection. We have plenty in the tool cabinet. I always like to wear them when I'm making a cut, just because I want to protect my hearing so that way I can have better hearing when I'm older. So if you want to wear these because it's too loud for you, if it just bothers you, you are more than welcome to. I always like to when I am using the machine. So just to review the 3 main rules that I have: when you always keep your hands away from the cutting zone, always keep the board flat up against the fence, and always make sure you are hanging onto the board. Those 3 are very, very important. So that is the miter saw. I think I pretty much have everything covered. If you have any questions when you're using the miter saw, always come and see me. I am always happy to answer those questions anytime I can. If you need to re-watch this again, please go ahead and do that so you can get everything figured out. But otherwise, that's miter saw safety.